Airing first on Asheville FM, this is The Final Straw, a weekly anarchist anti-authoritarian radio show broadcasting from occupied Jaligi land in southern Appalachia. We bring you voices and perspectives from people, projects, and struggles around the world engaging in the long project toward liberation. You can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or at protonmail.com, and send us letters at P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 610 Haywood Road. Firestorm is a locally owned cooperative specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop. This week on the show, we are pleased to present an interview with María Kamila, who is a teacher and a popular journalist who works with the anarchist Colombian journalism and counter-information collective in Bogotá called Subversión. We originally reached out to talk about the current wave of protests and riots in Colombia, and this interview covers many topics, ranging from a historical contextualization of the current moment, who are on the front lines of the protests, indigenous solidarity with anarchist accomplices via the Minga, which is a pre-colonial term for collaboration, meeting, or communal action, and many more topics. Please see our show notes for further topics that our guests discussed, for any reading or research you would like to do based on this interview. And as always these days, look forward to a complete written transcript of this episode up at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org, and that should be up in a few days. To follow Subversión on Instagram and Twitter. For Instagram, it's at Subversión, or subversion_cc, and Twitter, it's at @ccsubversion_. To look at their website, which includes articles in Spanish and photo essays, visit ccsubversion.wordpress.com. If you would like to use this interview for your project or podcast, please feel free to do so. Just send us an email at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net to let us know.
Thank you pretty much for this space. I have to really say that it's pretty important to be here. So, well, my name is María Kamila. I'm a teacher. I'm a foreign language teacher, and I am also a popular journalist that is part of a collective called Subversión. Let's say our main job is trying to communicate from some other points of view.
Do you have... let's say, could you speak a little bit more about your collective Subversión? How did this group begin, and what is more about the work that you do?
Yes, of course. Well, first, the group started in 2015 as an organization close to the anarchist student group, or HEA, in Colombia. Mm-hmm. And let's say that this group started with the need to confront state propaganda, right? Government, media, and all those kind of information they gave us as people. So let's say that we saw the need to dispute some truths that were broadcast on television and social networks, and we tried to speak a little bit about the work of people, right? Mm-hmm. How were the dynamics, for example, in the neighborhoods, how the student movement was doing in that time. So let's say now we're trying to connect and link every single kind of struggles we have been doing. So, for example, we link with the communities of Cauca, Creek, and Liberación de la Madre Tierra. We also have anti-prison platforms. We have some art collectives in terms of graffitis, in terms of music. So let's say that's our main purpose. We also realize maybe that there are very, very few experiences of anarchist or libertarian media, and in that minority, we could notice that a large part of them speak or pay more attention on the international work. International work such as Greece, Chile, Mexico. So they didn't focus pretty well in their local reality itself. So we tried to do it. That's a little summary about it.
That's awesome. I think it's really cool that it started coming out of the anarchist student movement. That's really powerful, I think. So just to kind of give a little bit of context about what y'all have been going through this last little while, could you talk about how the COVID-19 pandemic and maybe more importantly the government's response to it affected your ability to organize?
Okay, well, of course, COVID-19 and pandemic and lockdowns was pretty shocking for people in general, I'd say. And let's say that in terms of organization, it's been quite hard because, for example, here in Colombia, we still are facing arbitrary quarantines. And let's say that the government tries to tell us, okay, this is for you, this is necessary, but we already think that it's not like that. And we could say that these kind of quarantines are being more pro-exploitation than pro-healthcare, maybe. So it's been really, really hard, obviously because we have no basic income. There are no relevant money that government has to give us in order to stay home. So basically, you can go out during weekdays, but on weekends you can't do it because of your health, supposedly. So it's just having a permission to go out to work. So it's quite hard and quite difficult, of course. Let's say that many spaces that we had in a presential way had to be more into the virtuality. We had to transfer those kind of spaces. Some of them got lost, of course. For example, the anti-prison movement and the anti-prison platforms are not finished but stopped, right? Because of the pandemic. I could also say, and I think it should be an advantage, and it's the resistance from other spaces. For example, social networks, forums, popular schools, because let's say that education can have this alternative that is virtual. So let's say that we try to take advantage of it. However, it's really, really difficult because of time, mostly. Most of the companies, I don't know, they feel like if you are at home, you have to work every single day. So the schedule you used to have, it's not the same one, because your boss can call you, I don't know, at 8 p.m. and tell you, hey, I'm really sorry, but I already know you are home, so could you please help me with this? So let's say that, I don't know, the line we had before going to our job and coming back home, it's not anymore, because we're working from home. So yeah, I'd say that's a little matter of what we are facing in here. Also, for example, the control of spaces, of course, the public and the common places to be are not anymore places to be, and they are not public anymore. So they are being managed by the government. So they basically decide, and they basically say, okay, this place, since it's more from the government than for people, can have tables on the street, for example. But the restaurants, I don't know, the popular restaurants in the neighborhoods, a lot of business that basically are in order to help and are made by popular people, they can't be opened. So of course we have this kind of class social, right? So it's been really hard. So yes, that's a little bit about it.
Thank you for talking about that. I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has sort of created a lot of circumstances that the government and the state and the prisons are using to sort of expand their power. Like you said, with the bosses calling you at 8 p.m. when you're supposed to be off at 5 or whatever time, to be like, hey, you're still at work because you're at home, so you're always at work. And I think that's a very dangerous expansion of the state and the prison and the work's power, like, into our lives, so we never have a break from it.
Yes, and I think that due to this expansion you were talking about, it's really, really tough, because in some cases, personally, I feel in some cases my bosses are just putting a lot of work, telling me, okay, you need to do this and you need to do this, just in order to make you work, and that's it. Like, I don't know how I could say it, but it is like they need to show themselves that you are working. So it's really, really difficult. Mostly, for example, in my case, as a teacher, it's been really hard, because you need to create a lot of reports, and you need to send them to many people, and it's really, really stressful. So yes, but the expansion of power, of course, it's really, really tough.
Yeah, I totally agree. I feel like we could talk about that probably for a long time, but we're here to speak about the ongoing protests in Colombia, but this current situation has been unfolding for some time now. Will you speak about the protests which occurred in 2019 to 2020 in response to police corruption and austerity, among other things?
Yeah, well, I would like to start this answer saying that during the last 20 years, Colombia has experienced a series of strikes, protests, riots that have grown through the time, right? So these stages, or these riots and these consecutive strikes, has been in response to the criminal policies of the far-right government of Uribe, of course, which, I don't know, he has had hegemony in the executive branch since 2002. So imagine. And let's say that the police violence that we have experienced in current years, or in recent years, is a clear example of the doctrine they form state security forces. And this doctrine is about the internal enemy, right? So the people you're trying to protect, you don't really have to protect them, because they are your enemy, right? So to this, of course, we need to add the increase in poverty, that the half of the population, closely to the half, reaches poverty and lives in poverty. So they eat once or twice per day, if they eat. So, of course, there are more than 20 million people who don't live with dignity under the power of the state. And regarding 2009, that I consider is the initial stage of the strike that is taking place currently, I would say that the reason for the protest was a dissatisfaction of a large part of the Colombian population with the economic, social, and environmental policies of the government of the president, and as well as the handling that was given to the peace accords with the FARC, with the guerrilla. And of course, this had many consequences, such as the murder of social leaders, where you can find peasants, indigenous people, reinserted ex-guerrillas, and of course the corruption within the Colombian government. I mean, Colombia is one of the most corrupt countries you can find around the world, not only Latin America, but the world. So I think it would also be important to mention, in a historical key maybe, that the mobilizations or the riots and the strikes of 2019 and 2020 have previous situations in the student strike of 2018, and this in the agrarian strikes of 2015 and 2013, which leads us to talk about the student movement of 2011 called MANI, or Mesa Amplia Nacional Estudiantil. So I could say that this information is really important, because we can notice that the government has done nothing for trying to fix what they need to fix. So strikes that happened previous years and that is happening right now, it's just like a chain. I imagine since the poverty is a change, since discrimination is a chain and poverty, well, we also need to react that way. So we also need to say, hey, this is not good, this is enough, so we need to do something. So yes.
It seems like Colombia is experiencing what a lot of places are experiencing, which is a rise in far-right fascist governments, and also paralleled with just like increasing austerity. I understand like the Colombian people are living underneath a really oppressive tax law that maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. But yeah, thank you for going through the progression of, riots and strikes and student movements to sort of set the stage for the things that happened later. So, like you mentioned, there have been other protests and riots in response to murders by police since 2019. Would you speak about these kind of and how they sort of led into what is currently happening?
Sure. Let's say related to this topic, we could talk a little about the historical overview of the deaths done by Policía Nacional and SMAT that start with the murder of Nicolas Neira around 15 or 16 years ago. Nico was a teenager who was killed by the SMAT in a working riot, the May 1st manifestation. So we could start from there. We could also mention Oscar Salas, Dylan Cruz, among others. And something to highlight here is that the collective memory has been a result of these events. For example, and related to 2019 and 2020, the police massacre that occurred on September 4th, 9th, and 10th has in the neighborhoods where these events took place. So the friends and relatives of the victims have organized themselves in several organizations to be able to demand for justice, denounce the criminality of the state and the police. And it's quite sad because so far we haven't known the responsible in the command lines of those days. I mean, we have no idea who ordered these kind of crimes. And related to this, a group of graffiti artists and street artists has also been organized to commemorate every single month by making some murals in the city, denouncing the massacre and making memory of the people who are not with us anymore. And I think it is also important to talk about street action itself. Bringing the confrontation to the neighborhoods, it's a new paradigm in recent history at the urban level that has no correlation since the 77 strike here in Colombia. And of course, we need to speak a lot about historical way and history about Colombia, because now the discontent is of the young people who suffer harassment by the police. And of course, in that sense, although the actions have denoted in specific circumstances, such as the murder of Javier Ordóñez or the rapes and violence based on gender, at the end, we are involved in confrontations of historical roots, right? That establish, and of course, as I told you before, we are aware that the authority is our enemy, right? No matter how they try to sell us the speech of peace and dialogue and we're just here to help you and protect you, it's not like that. And we can try to talk about this from the facts that happened and that you mentioned. Of course, I mean, police abuse in Colombia, it's something really, really sad and frustrating because, of course, they are quite like an arm for the government. So they are pretty bloody. They don't care about children, pregnant women, old people. They don't care about it. So you already know that when SMAT arrives in a protest, it's going to be a riot, right? So you need either run or face what you need to face in that time.
Yeah, that sounds really terrifying. And, of course, police violence is a sort of truth wherever there are police. But you mentioned, and this wasn't one of the questions that I sent to you, but you did mention the disarmament of the FARC. And I understand that sort of, and the FARC it has its problems, to be sure, very many of them, but I'm wondering what you think about how the disarmament and persecution of former FARC members has contributed to the current oppression of far left and anarchist organizing currently, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. I think that actually we had a book. We're trying to make it digital, whose name is Reflexiones Libertarias sobre el Acuerdo de Paz. And it is something in English like Libertary Reflections about Accord Peace or Agreement Peace. And let's say that since we stood into an anarchist position, we could say that democracy has always had a better place to be, right? And of course, it's related to the power. So we didn't predict what was going to happen related to the persecution and all those deals, but let's say that the government has not been clear, has not done anything about this kind of agreements in terms of, for example, trying to give the peasants back his lands, his farms, maybe. And I could say that this is not new. At least in Colombia, it has happened for twice, maybe. So, for example, when we talk about M19, it happened the same. They did a peace agreement and they said, okay, we're not going to be armed anymore. We're going to try to solve this conflict into the dialogue and all those deals. And some of them were murdered, right? Carlos Pizarro, for example, was murdered a few days later. So I'd say it's something that we expected. Of course, we didn't want to happen, but it was something that, yes, we expected.
This is the Final Straw Radio Show, and I'm your host, William Goodenough. I'm speaking with a member of the anarchist counter-information collective Subversión, based in Bogotá, Colombia, about the recent wave of police violence against protesters in that country. Follow them on Instagram at subversion_cc, on Twitter at ccsubversion_, and online at ccsubversion.wordpress.com. And now we will have a musical break from the anarcho-punk band Chaos Records. That's like chaos, but with a C at the end of it, off their album La Masacre Continua, the proceeds from which are being donated to on-the-ground efforts to protect comrades in protest. You can hear this album on Bandcamp by searching La Masacre Continua. Here is the track Cuerpos de Paz.
Somebody
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, sadly. Would you speak about the current protests and what led to them? We would also love to hear about who is on the front lines or primera línea, and what does this say about them and say about the general nature of the protests?
Yeah, of course. Well, first, as I told you before, the strikes this year are the continuation of the strikes that we experienced at the end of 2009 and the beginning of 2020. We stopped those strikes because of pandemic and because of COVID-19. And first, the National Strike Committee, that includes retired organizations, some transporters, peasants, and the public Colombian teachers, have insisted in creating a plan to fight against the reforms that the government of Iván Duque has proposed since the beginning of his governation, such as health reform, education reform, now the taxes reform. And obviously, this committee doesn't represent people. This committee is led by maybe the bureaucracy and some political parties that are looking for consolidating their electoral power for next year elections. And fortunately, the demands of the committee have been overcome by the people who are confronting the police and SMAT in the street. And the population that has been in the streets wants Duque to quit, basically. And I would say we could make it out since 2 ministers and a police captain have already resigned. This specifically started with La Reforma Tributaria. However, of course, it was not our main purpose. We could achieve that this reform couldn't achieve the Congress and the number of votes they needed to do it. But we are also trying to establish the power from this side, right? Not like, I don't know, not like the revolution we already know, but it's really important, for example, and related to the committee, the strike committee, there are no young people. All of them are old men and old women who don't know what we need and what university people need and what teenagers need and what children need, because they don't really care, right? They are looking for a power in the future. So yes, that's basically what happened. There was also something that produced the anger of the people, and it was something that Carrasquilla said. Carrasquilla was the minister that was in charge of the food and the canasta familiar. I don't really know how to say that in English. And this man, a journalist, asked him how much a basket of eggs was. And he said, 1,800. That is, no, my God, that is like $5.50 maybe. So imagine. Of course, the people said, what? That's no possible. So if the person that is supposed to be in charge of telling the people how much we should and we could pay for food, for services, well, we need to do something. And that was the last situation we accept. So people started to say, no way, this is not going to be possible. You can't do that because you don't really know how the real situation is. For example, I couldn't go out on April 28th, but my mom said, okay, we need to support the people who are on the streets. So you could walk through the neighborhoods and you could see some ads maybe or some cartels saying no to the Reforma Tributaria. I don't know, for example, in my house we wrote, we love beans, this family loves eating beans but without IVA. So let's say that the creativity and the union that this strike has been developing, it's been amazing, because not only are the same people who are on the streets, there are not only university people, there are also school people, there are also private teachers, there are also people who are in charge of trading, and people who have also suffered the pandemic and that is aware of this crisis we are going to face if we don't change what they want to do. And I almost forgot it. Related to the first line, the first line has been made up mostly of young people from the popular neighborhoods and the periphery. And it's quite shocked because recently we have seen the formation of the front lines of mothers who have been suffered policial abuse, or that they have just lost his or her children in the strike. So it's like a first line made by mothers. And I would say that we also believe that the first line has been constituted by indigenous people, who is made up of the Indigenous Guard or Minga. Let's say that these kind of people, they are an autonomous group of indigenous, and they have a lot of processes, and they have been in the cities, and they had faced the police and the SMAT in the riots. And I guess we could talk a little bit about the boom of the first line that has been built here in Colombia. It's thanks to the Chilean experience, where the creation of these fronts was fundamental to face the state violence in the streets. And regarding the first line, it is worth mentioning the work of Black Flags, which is a first line that is anarchist. They mostly help in Medellin, and thanks to the social media, they have helped other cities to share the abuse and the violence made by the police, and that the SMAT also has committed. So let's say that this first line is being really, really important. It has a disadvantage that maybe we already knew that was going to happen, and it was related to the stereotype, right? So these kind of guys are there because they are vandals, they steal the city, they don't do anything. Here in Colombia, there is a sentence, or like a saying, really, really common into the right people, and it's that the people who protest, it's because we want every single thing for free. So, yeah, in Spanish is quieren todo regalado. So, yes, let's say that the first line has suffered, of course, this stigmatization, but they had faced in a pretty good way. And they had, they had showed us that they are really, really brave, and that they are not just fighting for fighting, right? They are fighting because they already know what they are fighting for. So education, basically for eating 3 times at least a day, for having a job, for having a life that allows to say to you that they have dignity, right? So yes, it's been really interesting because, for example, here in Bogotá, the main first line is in Portal de las Américas, that is on the south. And of course, this area of the city is forgotten by the government. So the government thought that just because of having their Transmilenio or public transportation, they were going to have a better life. But of course, we know it's not like that. So yes, it's been amazing. It's been really, really nice, that job. And mostly because they also have education spaces, maybe. So they discuss about the situation. They say, okay, here in this neighborhood, we need this, this, and this. So we need to make people know why we are here and what we need. So let's say it's a really, really complete and connected struggle that they have done.
Thank you for going through that. It sounds like so dynamic and vibrant, and the international media has been seeing a lot of sort of the violence of the police in places where the strikes and the riots are most intense, and horrifying stuff, terrifying police activity and violence. But I think it's also really good to keep in mind that, there's really, beautiful things that can happen as well in situations like this. And that sounds like a really amazing people coming together and, struggling towards something together.
For sure.
I'm also really interested in your suggestion to talk about the asambleas barriales, which are neighborhood assemblies which have been forming during these moments of riot. Will you speak about this, and how's it been doing anarchist organizing throughout these efforts?
Yeah. Let's say that understanding that this strike has been as organic as it has been necessary, because most of the people didn't expect to last the days it is lasting. And it is really important trying to understand this, like it's really organic, because this allows us to assume the need for political and historical formation of the protesters. So with this purpose, the neighborhood assemblies have arisen to try to create spaces for discussion, formation, and execution of the strike from the neighborhoods. As I told you, it's not student movement who is in charge of it or who is leading this process. It's people, or mostly young people of the neighborhoods. So, of course, the historical, political education, it's quite important. So that's what asambleas barriales are for. And with this purpose, the neighborhood has started to create little groups, and they have created some instructions, let's say. So, for example, I don't know, the people who are in charge of collecting food, the other people are going to be in charge of keeping everything safe and all those deals. And artistic days maybe have been seen. I don't know, there are so many pictures about towns, cities with anti-Uribe slogans. So that's a result of the discussions and the debates that are in the neighborhoods, saying, okay, here we have a political position and we don't want Uribe here. So they have painted the walls with this. They have painted the highways with this. And of course, the tributes to the victims in the strike. There had also had a lot of artistic shows and artistic masterpiece around the city. And let's say that due to the police abuse, training about human rights has been mandatory. What to do in case of an arbitrary detention. And of course, we as a collective, or as a contra-information collective, the support has been attending these spaces and trying to communicate before, during, and after these assemblias happen. And I also think it's really important to mention that the participation of the anarchism as a movement, we already know that is marginal because of its nature. And maybe we could relate the anarchist movement into the efforts of collectives and individuals in terms of education, right? Mm-hmm. We could also mention the community organization. So they are also based in horizontal structures, and they are rotating responsibilities. Of course, they need to have a self-management of spaces. And let's say that we could relate these kind of practices and these kind of routines from and since the libertarian movement, taking into account the autonomy and the self-action we need to have, of course, because trying to make people realize we don't need a leader in order to make good things and in order to make things work.
Yeah, that all sounds, also really amazing. And I could imagine it being like perhaps a bit like chaotic to be organizing as anarchists and doing any kind of sort of collective process in the middle of like a popular street movement going on. I think we can all sort of relate to that from personal experience to varying degrees. So it sounds like people are holding it down, which is really amazing.
Yeah, totally. And let's say that these kind of meetings and these kinds of assembleas has also allowed an acknowledge about the people who were before protesting. So, of course, we said, okay, right, you're now facing this, but do you remember in 2019 when you saw or when you watched on the news that students have been debating and have been on the streets? Remember? So it's been really interesting because, of course, it's I don't know if respect is the real word, but every single person that attends to this kind of dynamics has been aware of the matter and the importance of the social movement.
I think we can all sort of understand that the world, at least the documented world, insofar as, we film and, we take pictures and stuff, that kind of documentation is becoming perhaps like a bit more riotous, or, there's been a lot of global like struggles around the world against fascism, and many have commented on the connected nature of these fights against, fascism, like I said, the police state, and settler colonialism all around the world, from these extrajudicial acts of violence and also people coming together to fight those acts in Colombia, to the state of Israel bombing refugee camps in occupied Palestine, to the government mismanagement of COVID in India, to the fights against pipelines and unceded indigenous land in so-called Canada, and to the battles for Black lives here, and the ongoing battles against gendered violence all over the world. Would you speak about this from your own perspective, and has your collective been sort of speaking about this as it's been unfolding?
Yeah, well, let's say that we could talk here about the indigenous struggle since the Minga of 2008, their plans for life and struggle, such as the recovery of lands and the historical memory of these people, right? During these days, some of the monuments that are in the cities have suffered an indigenous trial made by the indigenous of themselves, causing the demolition, for example, of the statues of Sebastián de Belalcázar and Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada. I could say that it hasn't happened before, and I could say it's an achievement that indigenous people have had, mostly because people who live in the city don't care or don't know or don't want to know about this kind of a struggle, because they feel and they think indigenous people are really, really far, right? So bringing the Minga to the cities, having these kind of spaces with them, has allowed us to recognize the real roots we had, right? So of course a lot of people said, no, but how were you gonna do that? It was Gonzalo Jiménez de Quesada, he did this, he blah blah blah. And I love this kind of movements and indigenous people, because they are also in the mood of teaching. So for example, if you go to them and you tell them, okay, I don't agree with you, he or she is going to tell you, okay, let me explain you. So they are also in the mood, in the teacher mood, and this is really necessary nowadays. So I could say that this struggle, it's been so hard and so far in terms of time, thanks to them, because they have been with us on the streets, on the committees, on every single way we could discuss and talk about the strike and face the strike. And I definitely have to say that the struggles are connected, because at the end they express, of course, with nuance and differences of context, the deep contradictions of capital, the colonies, patriarchy, and ecological destruction, for example. And it is not a coincidence, not only in the temporality, but also in the similarities on the demands, right? The repertories of a struggle, the dispute for the lands of the peasants, the working rights maybe citizens are trying to look for. And this allows us to observe or realize or notice that the peoples are also twinned in those common conditions of oppression. Mm-hmm. It is a system that operates on a planetary scale, and we need to say that it is sustained by the people that are lead to exploitation of the mass of people for the benefits of opulent and rich minorities. And I also feel really necessary regarding the transversalities of the struggles that we are talking. We need, of course, to speak of the gender struggles that have been growing, and they have been stronger in the same way. It is also pretty important to understand that police repression and police oppression is marked by the perception of women's bodies as spoils of war. Mm-hmm. And in consequence, there is an instrumentalization of these bodies that we have had, for example, in here during these days. We have had 87 reports of gender violence, including rape, including a girl who committed suicide because she was abused by the SMAT, abuse and sexual aggression, as well as threats and harassment. So, of course, these struggles have to be connected. It's really important. I would say that it's an advance if we look a little bit to the past. It is not something that people in the past could achieve. And I think that this strike has a lot to connect and link all struggles we have had through the time. So students, workers, indigenous people, peasant, teachers, of course, public teachers, private teacher, every single person in a same place. And that place, of course, is the struggle place.
I think that's such a good point that you made just now, how police repression is marked by the perception of women's bodies and how there are the similarities and demands of striking and rioting people all over the world. Like, we can see this in India, we can see this in Palestine, we can see this here in the so-called United States. So I think that's such a good point that you just made, and I'm going to be thinking about that for a while.
And it's been pretty cool, cool in the terms of political way, and pretty interesting because, for example, in some protest, people write, fight like Colombia, resist like Palestine, and vote like Chile. So it's quite interesting how this journey of strikes has made aware to the people that this is not just in Colombia. This is around the world. And this is around the world in terms of land, in terms of gender abuses, gender violence. It's also about, of course, exploitation problems and issues. It's also something related to the Black movement, right? Because every single person, I say that it has suffered in some way. Maybe a lot of people are not aware of it, but one of the achievements and goals that we have already did was that, making people aware of the difficult situation. And the matter that if we don't change this, it is going to be worse. With taxes, with violence, with insecurity, well, with a lot of deals here.
Yes, I think that is very, very true. So, what can listeners do to help support you?
First of all, be aware of alternative media, such as Subversión, of course, and try to spread all information among people who are fighting to change the world. Try not to believe too much, for example, in our national information media or channels, because they don't say the truth, maybe. They try to change a lot. I also think that join the acts of denunciation and protest in front of the embassies and consulates of Colombia. That has helped a lot in terms of international points of view, because the world knows what is going on in here. So, of course, let's say that currently several campaigns are being organized from different organizations to make these actions. So, for example, we know that the IWW, which is affiliated to the International Confederation of Workers, established a statement in solidarity with the struggle of the people here in Colombia, and they are planning actions of denunciation. So if you can do it, wonderful. If no, you can share, for example, you can post, you can use the hashtag and all those deals. In terms of money, we're having a collect mostly for this first line made by moms that I already told you, and we're trying to support the art. So the art collectives are being supported by us. And yeah, I would say the most important deal should be and could be spread the information and spread all information you could think it's useful to other people know.
Absolutely. Where can people donate to the collection for Primera Línea and the art collectives?
We have a PayPal account,
Cool.
which is, well, I don't know how I could send it to you.
If you want to send it to me, I will publish it in the show notes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna leave it to you to the chat. So
That sounds great.
through PayPal, yes, through PayPal you can donate through there. I guess it's the easiest way.
María Kamila, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with me and talk to me about what's been going on, and for doing the... It should be mentioned, too, that you did a lot of work to consolidate voices from the collective that you're a part of so that they could have a voice in this interview as well. And that takes a lot of work. It's been really wonderful getting to talk to you and sit down a little bit. Is there anything that we missed in this interview that you want to sort of give voice to in closing, or sort of any last words that you would leave listeners with?
Well, I really appreciate this space, this meeting with you, because I think it's the better way to spread the information and try to make people realize our current situation. So thank you pretty much. And I think it was really enough, maybe, the interview. I would like to highlight that it's quite important to the education, maybe, through this topic. And let's say that one of the flags, maybe, the strike has now is make you realize the art has to be political, and in that sense and in that way, it's like an invitation to listen to, for example, artists that support the strike, listen to some group music that talk about the situation in Colombia, follow, for example, the collectives of the people who are in charge of the murals, of course, follow us in terms of having you informed about the situation in Colombia, because we are a communicative collective. So yes, I could say that in order to conclude. And of course, thank you pretty much. It was amazing.
Please see our show notes for further topics that our guests discussed. For any reading or research you would like to do based on this interview, including more about the Minga and the Guarda de Cauca, an ongoing struggle for indigenous autonomy from the Colombian government and corporations. We will also link to Subversion's PayPal, through which they are fundraising for much-needed medical supplies for people on the front lines of the protests. You can also look forward to a complete written transcript of this episode, for reading along, translation purposes, or for sending to a friend, up at thefinalstrawradio.noblogs.org. Follow Subversion on Instagram at subversion_cc, and on Twitter at @ccsubversion_. TFSR is a proud member of the Channel Zero network of anarchist podcasts. Here's a jingle from another member of CZN.
Hello, and welcome to We Will Remember Freedom, a monthly podcast of anarchist fiction. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to Live Like the World is Dying, your podcast for what feels like the end times. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. Hello, and welcome to the jingle for both of my podcasts. I'm your host, Margaret Killjoy. You can find my podcasts wherever you get your podcasts or get them from the Channel Zero network.
This is The Final Straw. You can email us with questions or suggestions at thefinalstrawradio@riseup.net or at protonmail.com, and send us letters at P.O. Box 6004, Asheville, North Carolina 28816. This show is brought to you by Firestorm Books, located at 610 Haywood Road. Firestorm is a locally owned cooperative specializing in offbeat, underground, and independent literature. You can find a sample of Firestorm's catalog plus a full calendar of events at their website, firestorm.coop.